said on occasion that although awareness about ethical business practices has increased tremendously over the last few years, most Southern African companies, departments and organizations are still struggling to translate that into an ethical culture. Why did you say that?
It's interesting, in survey after survey, we see an increase in awareness about ethics in organizations. And we see it both in the public sector and in the private sector. And even when we compare it with other countries internationally, our awareness of ethics in South Africa is high and much higher than the global average. But culture is not about knowing. Culture is about doing, and doing so consistently. Because culture is the collective habits, the collective norms that develop in an organization. And you might know intellectually what the right thing to do is, but culture is to do it, and to do it consistently, even when nobody is watching. And therefore it should not surprise us that you get this disconnect between awareness on the one hand and also then the ethical culture, the way that we do things on the other side. And then there's another aspect which I think is quite crucial here, and that is the way in which some companies try to enforce their ethical standards is actually counterproductive. They would often almost try to intimidate people into doing the right thing. And you would hear them saying, we have zero tolerance. And you can hear what they are aiming for is fear-based compliance. But when you only do the right thing out of fear and not out of conviction, then you won't build that ethical culture. In fact, you might make people less responsible, ethically responsible over time, because they only do the right thing as long as somebody is watching.
How would you say leadership figures in an organization can help employees to internalize that culture of ethics?
I think there are two important aspects. The first one is leadership example. We know that culture is about collective habits, collective norms, collective ways of thinking about things. And the normal employee gets their cue from leaders. And therefore, the example set by leaders, and once again we are back to real conduct, not what they say, what they do. That is what gives employees the cue for what is acceptable and what is unacceptable, but also what is the criteria for success in our organization. So in that sense, leadership example, the leadership not only talk but also the walk is vitally important. But then there's another aspect, and that has to do with how leaders persuade their employees to adhere to certain standards. And there are different ways in which you can go about this. And the one way is to try and reward or punish them for either doing the right thing or the wrong thing. But once again, we are back to the problem that isn't a lasting solution, because it only works as long as somebody is either rewarding or punishing. And therefore the role of the leader is to convince people, not to entice them, to convince them, to persuade them that these standards that we have identified are in the best interest of the organization, its stakeholders, but also everyone working for this organization.
Let's pause for a second on the reward segment of what you said. In terms of my research, it came to my attention that there's a leadership culture that looks like this. If an employee makes an unethical decision that turns out to be successful, he will be rewarded by leadership. On the other hand, if an ethical decision turns out to be unsuccessful, the employee will be punished. In other words, a reward becomes the motivation for unethical decisions that bring good financial results. So as jy nou mos kry, like is alles reg. Enforcing a culture of everyone is doing it, so that is okay.
Yeah, it's not something new. It has been that over the ages. And that is what management endorses will ultimately become the norm in the organization. So if management starts endorsing unethical practices because it's profitable, it will soon become the norm. And very often it starts with very minor misdemeanors. And that gets acceptable. But because this misdemeanor is now acceptable, it makes it easier to move on to something bigger. And then eventually the rot sets in. It's almost like an immoral cancer that is invading the entire body of the organization. It always starts small, but over time it can grow into something really ugly. And that is when a big reset is called for. And very often the reset either comes in the form of a wake-up call, like a scandal, where people turn their back on you and you are caught out, you are humiliated, you are fined. But I've often seen also that peers in your same industry can learn a lot from that. In other words, all organizations don't need to go all the way down this wrong path and only hit rock bottom and then return. I often see that companies say, we should not find ourselves in a similar position than our competitor who has just been caught out. So therefore, often in a scandal, it's not only the company who is affected, who has a big moral or ethical reform, but it can affect the entire industry as well.
In terms of the Namibian conversation, and I'll respect your decision not to comment directly, if that is what you are comfortable with, more comfortable with. In the Namibian setup, and like in the South African context, there's been a larger conversation going on, specifically the fact that many insurance companies sit on huge cash reserves, and in the context of delayed business interruption claims, then refrain from paying out timeously. In my view, it translates to ethical transgression. If you
look at any insurance contract, and you now talk specifically about business interruption insurance, it's an agreement, and there's a principle of reciprocity there, that I will pay my monthly premiums, and when something happened or happens that is covered within our contract, then it's your time or your turn to refund me. And if there's a blatant breaking of that reciprocity, of that promise, I will do this, you will do that, of course that is unfair, and I think it borders on dishonesty, and hopefully a few lessons has been learned. And very often we see, not only with business interruption, but also even with life insurance and other forms of short-term insurance, that insurance companies try to hide behind the law and say, legally, I am entitled not to pay out your claim. And we had recent cases also here in South Africa where a company tried to hide behind a legal point in a contract, but it was so blatant that what they were doing was unfair, that in the end, even after the courts confirmed that the insurance company is correct, they decided, in the light of the huge moral outcry against the blatant unfairness of their decision, that they will pay out that claim.
Moral outcry, yes. I get the impression from my research that leadership in certain instances know what's going on, but they're turning a blind eye because it's more convenient.
Yeah, the moment that you turn a blind eye, you are in fact actively endorsing. It might look like an act of passivity, but it's actually a positive action that you take. By doing nothing, you are doing something. You are actively endorsing that wrong practice. So what one should not think that if you haven't done anything, that you are now sort of no longer liable for what is happening in the organization. Doing nothing, in other words, the act of omission is also an act of commission.
That's one of my favorite quotes. Let's talk about the global culture, because I do think it brings new challenges. The whole phenomenon that the business is so big that the leadership figure cannot necessarily keep his hand on everything, which brings me to who is accountable. If we look at a relatively recent scandal, the Facebook issue with Zuckerberg, who was called before Senate, then the whistleblower said very specifically the buck stops with Zuckerberg. How do you feel about that?
I do believe that when it comes to the way we do business, when it comes to the culture of the organizations, the buck does stop at the top. But and I think this is recognized the world over, that sometimes you can have a situation where a leader is quite serious about enforcing an ethical culture and maturing an ethical culture in the organization. And then there might be a bad apple in the organization who, despite everything that leaders do in order to instill that ethical culture in the organization, nevertheless do something that runs counter to that. And even courts recognize that in such cases you can't blame the leaders, because the leaders have done what we would, as rational people, expect from leaders to do. And they can't be at every corner of the globe all the time. So in those cases, I think we have some sympathy for leaders, and as I said, even in the law, it's recognized that the organization and the leadership can't be blamed, but it can be blamed on a bad apple. But when there's a rotten barrel, and we don't talk now about one rotten apple, but a rotten barrel, then the buck stops at the top, because leaders are responsible for the ethical culture in the organization.
Sometimes in a research process over 4 or 5 months, there's a narrative that's unfolding. So in other words, it's not a once-off small transgression or half-truth.
Yeah.
There's a narrative.
Yeah.
Yeah, maybe you have ideas on that narrative unfolding over time.
No, and when we start looking at organizational culture, it's not about individual incidents. It's about patterns emerging over time and themes that are emerging over time. And therefore, it is typical of culture that if there is a rotten culture in an organization, you would see many manifestations of that over time. While if there's a strong, mature, ethical culture in an organization, it's not a case that there will be no misdemeanors, but they would be isolated, they would be rare, and they would be dealt with quite decisively.
One of my challenges for this particular project was to get people to speak up, because there's a culture of silence. In other words, I want to pause for a second at the relationship between parties in a chain of command. In this case, it would be the broker, the insurer, the loss assessor. So everybody in that chain is benefiting from one source. In the Namibian context, there's also currently court cases, so the sub judice term comes in. So if you operate in a culture of silence, I started to realize it's very, very difficult to have an open conversation about anything.
Yeah, your organizational culture is never totally isolated or disconnected from the national culture within which you operate. And if there's a culture of silence, of we don't split on one another, and loyalty is the highest value and not honesty or fairness, then it becomes extremely difficult to speak up, because you really have to move against the grain of the national culture. And we often see that in countries where loyalty is a higher value than honesty or fairness, that it is extremely difficult to get people to speak up, and that whistleblowing is a very rare phenomenon. And of course, if it is known that there are dire consequences for speaking up, then people feel intimidated and they fear for their lives, and rightly so, because whistleblowers do get killed. We have some recent examples of that, not only here but also in other countries. So it's a lethal combination to have, on the one hand, a culture of silence in your country where loyalty is the highest value, trumping honesty and trumping fairness, and then on top of that, it is known that people in power use that power to come down on people who speak up.
Sure. Interesting thought that. What about honor amongst thieves?
Yeah, there is something like sort of limited morality. In other words, even in the mafia, there was some form of morality, but it was a very restricted inner circle who was protected, and it only applied to them and not to people on the outside. And that type of restricted morality, of course, is no morality, because morality is about treating people consistently.
Let's just quickly go back to Marcus Aurelius. He has another beautiful quote, and that is, "What is not good for the hive is not good for the bee."
No, true. And there's always interaction between, and we like to use the metaphor of the apple and the barrel. You are referring to the bee in the hive. But it's about the same thing. That there always is an interplay between the individual and the organization. But what we know from many different studies, especially your more psychological studies in workplaces, is that ultimately the culture is the stronger force, much stronger than the force of the single voice. And group conformity, groupthink is very often the norm. So it is very difficult for one individual to swim against the stream. But individuals sometimes can make a huge difference. It's often the whistleblower who exposes the rot in the organization, but very often the whistleblower get recognized for that. They are normally the martyrs, and they are the ones who pay for being honest and speaking up without being rewarded. And that is something very sad in our societies. But it is an indication that individuals can ultimately turn organizations around, albeit at a very high price.
Let's talk about leadership commitment in changing an ethical culture.
In our studies on culture, we found that there are a number of very important factors that will ultimately determine the strength and maturity of your ethical culture. And leadership commitment is one of the big factors there, but it's not the only factor. If you don't have also that same commitment to ethics in your middle management, the entire process of cultivating your culture just breaks down. But then there are also other factors that are quite important, and one of the most important ones is accountability. In other words, if you do something right, are there positive consequences? If you do something wrong, are there negative consequences? And other factors that also play a role is awareness about ethical standards, whether people feel that they are being treated fairly in the organization, and also the prevalence of ethics talk, ethics conversations in an organization. All of these factors contribute to your ethical culture in the end. And our experience is that ethics talk in an organization is a very good indicator. It's a very good proxy for the strength of your ethical culture. If people feel empowered to raise ethical issues, and there are often conversations about ethics, that is a very good sign that your ethical culture is maturing.
I agree. The term ethical blurring is an interesting term. It's almost like a fashionable word right now, but I'm sure you've been busy with it for many decades.
Yeah.
How would you describe a culture of ethical blurring?
I would describe it as where small unethical practices start creeping in and over time becomes part of the norm. In other words, that distinction between right and wrong, good and bad, acceptable and unacceptable starts blurring. And we often see that is how huge scandals start. Initially by just starting to slip on some of your ethical standards, and that becomes the new norm. And over time, it's a bit of a slippery slope then from there onwards. And that often calls for a big reset after a scandal.
You said something very profound that I wanted to pick up on. Yeah, the American Law Dictionary defines a contract as a promise in exchange for a promise in its simplest form, which I find very beautiful.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And that is the nature of a promise, that I promise to do something and you commit to do something in return. And that is the nature of such an agreement between parties. And obviously when you break that, and you absolutely have no grounds for breaking so, you are acting in a dishonest manner, and it is reprehensible.
You mentioned hiding behind the small print in a legal context. Which brings me to an interesting phrase, the letter of the law versus the spirit of the law.
Yeah.
I'm sure in your many talks over the years that must have come up.
Yeah, and we always say that the law floats in a sea of ethics. It's a famous saying by a US judge who said that. And the law is always an attempt to articulate the norms of a society. But very often, laws are out of sync with the moral sentiments of a society. And that is why moral critique of the law is so important. Because it is perfectly possible for something to be legal but highly unethical, like we had in the case of apartheid laws in South Africa. That was the laws on the law book. But I think there's a global consensus that although it was legal, it is unethical. While if you take a figure like Nelson Mandela, what he did was to deliberately break the law. But there's also a global consensus that he was on the moral high ground. He was doing the right thing. And he was willing to pay very heavily for breaking the law, but out of the conviction, based on the conviction that the law is wrong. And I think therefore this dynamic relationship between the law and ethics is very important. And I find it quite telling that in the Fourth King report on corporate governance in South Africa, under the very first principle, it calls on leaders to act ethical beyond mere legal compliance.
Why do you say that the financial cost of ethics is way bigger than the possible physical loss of money?
I think there are mainly two considerations. The first one is that any business's success depends on the commitment of its people. We often refer to that as staff morale. And staff morale is about how dedicated, how enthusiastic are staff about their jobs. And the first thing that goes when there is unethical behavior is your staff morale. And there are studies that show that in cases where there's serious corruption in companies, it's not the fines, it's not the reputational loss, but it's the loss of staff morale that over time inflicts the most damage to that company, also in terms of its profitability. Because you can only perform as well as the people are willing to perform in the organization. But there's a second consideration, and that is that if you look at any business, a business is a network of relationships, of stakeholder relationships. And a business only flourish when all stakeholders play their parts and do so with dedication to the company. And the first thing that goes when you start treating your stakeholders unethically is that you alienate them. And then this whole network of relationships starts to collapse. And ultimately, therefore, it is clear that ethics is a precondition for not only the success, but also for the sustainability of any organization. Unethical behavior ultimately will undermine your company.
Just one last thing on your personal experience in terms of cultural phenomena, comparing South Africa to Namibia. You've done a lot of work in Namibia. Is there anything that comes to mind in terms of audience questions that's different in Namibia compared to your speeches, say, in South Africa?
Not really. Not really. I think there's a lot of similarities between the two countries, that they often struggle with similar problems. If I think about, for example, state-owned enterprises and building strong ethical cultures and installing competent leaders across state-owned enterprises, it is something that I think we encounter in both countries, so I don't really see big exceptions there. If we go back to the Greek origin of the word ethics, ethos, then it refers to your character and your manners. In other words, the type of person that you are and how you treat other people. And when it was translated into Latin, moralis, then we get exactly the same meaning again. It's once again about your character and your manners. So in that sense, people often try to make a big difference between ethics and morality. In my understanding, I try to use the two interchangeably, as most people do, by the way. But in just a day-to-day understanding of what ethics is all about, I always prefer to use the triangle of the self, the good, and the other. In other words, one is ethical when you don't only consider what is good for yourself, but balance that with what is good for others. And there's something that we find the world over called the Golden Rule. And the Golden Rule is found in all religions, in all cultures. And that basically comes back to that triangle of the self, the good, and the other. Because the Golden Rule says, always do good unto others as you expect others to do good unto yourself. So in that sense, I think there is a global gold standard for ethics. You can go to any part of the world. That is my experience, having traveled around the world, and people understand what you are talking about when you talk about ethics. Where they differ is about what's the content of the good. But on the whole matter, that we need to treat others in a way that is not only good for us but also good for them, there is a global agreement.
That's very beautiful. So let's net om alles mooi saam te vat, let's quickly pause on the whole difference between ethics in your personal life and then ethics in the corporate realm.
Yeah. So if we define personal ethics as around the triangle of the self, the good, and the other, then personal ethics is about me treating others in a manner that is not only good for me but also good for them. If we take that same concept to organizational ethics, then it's about the standards of the organization, the standards of right and wrong, good and bad, that the organization as the self, the collective self, uses in its interaction with others, which are stakeholders and the broader society. So it's the same triangle of the self, the good, and the other, but it's now the good of the organization and not the good of the individual that is at stake. And those standards of good that should be applied to everyone that you interact with inside and outside the organization.
Thank you for your time. I really enjoyed the conversation.
Yeah, it's a pleasure.